What would you do if your male colleague stood in front of your entire executive team and explained your own invention to you as if you'd never seen it before? What if he took credit for 18 months of your blood, sweat, and sleepless nights, then had the audacity to teach you how your own technology worked? Well, I didn't just sit there and take it. I did something that made him wish he'd never learned my name. This is the story of how I turned the tables on a mansplainer so completely that he lost his job, his reputation, and his future, while I became the patent holder, the lawsuit winner, and the woman who changed an entire industry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Chen, and if you'd told me 3 years ago that I'd be sitting in a corner office with my name on the door, holding a patent worth millions and a lawsuit settlement that changed my life forever, I would have laughed. Not because I didn't believe I was capable, but because back then, I was still naive enough to think that hard work and brilliance would automatically earn recognition in the corporate world. I should have known better. I really should have. 3 years ago, I was a 26-year-old biomedical engineer, fresh out of MIT, working at Phoenix Dynamics, a mid-sized medical device company tucked away in the hills of Austin, Texas. The building was one of those sleek glass structures that tech companies love, all clean lines and open spaces designed to make you feel innovative just by walking through the lobby. But despite the modern architecture and the motivational posters about disruptive innovation, Phoenix Dynamics was still very much an old boys club where ideas belonged to whoever could speak the loudest in meetings. I worked in research and development, which sounds impressive until you realize that in a company of 200 employees, the R&D department consisted of exactly 4 people crammed into a converted storage room in the basement. The fluorescent lights buzzed constantly, the ventilation was terrible, and my desk was wedged between a broken 3D printer and a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened since the Clinton administration. But I loved that cramped little lab, because it was where I could disappear into my work and build things that mattered. The project that would change everything started with my little brother Jake. Jake was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 12, and I'd watched him struggle for years with the constant finger pricks, the blood glucose testing strips, the daily routine of stabbing himself multiple times just to monitor his condition. He was brave about it, braver than I would have been, but I could see how it wore him down. The pain, the inconvenience, the way he had to interrupt whatever he was doing to test his blood sugar level. During my final semester at MIT, I'd written my master's thesis on wireless biosensors, specifically focusing on non-invasive glucose monitoring. The technology existed, but it was clunky, expensive, and unreliable. Most continuous glucose monitors required surgical implantation and frequent calibration. What diabetics really needed was something simple, painless, and accurate, something that could give them real-time readings without turning their fingertips into pincushions. That's when the idea for GlucoSync was born. I spent my first 6 months at Phoenix Dynamics, learning the ropes, understanding how medical device development worked in the real world, and quietly researching the market potential for continuous glucose monitoring. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 30 million Americans had diabetes, and the global market for glucose monitoring devices was projected to reach almost $9 billion But more importantly than the money, and this is what really drove me, millions of people like Jake were suffering through daily finger pricks, when the technology existed to make their lives so much better. So I started building. Every evening after my official work hours ended, I'd stay in that basement lab and work on my prototype. I bought components with my own money, micro needles, wireless sensors, miniature processors, and slowly assembled what would become the first working version of glucose. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, a patch smaller than a Band-Aid that used microscopic needles to sample interstitial fluid just beneath the skin's surface. No pain, no blood, no disruption to daily life. Just continuous, accurate glucose readings transmitted wirelessly to a smartphone app. The technical challenges were immense. The micro needles had to be exactly the right depth, deep enough to reach the interstitial fluid, but shallow enough to avoid nerve endings. The wireless transmission had to be power efficient enough to run for days on a single battery. The calibration algorithm had to account for individual metabolic differences, temperature variations, and skin impedance fluctuation. Each problem took weeks or months to solve, and I solved them all in that basement lab, one breakthrough at a time. My personal life essentially disappeared. My college friends stopped inviting me to happy hours because I was always working on something important. My mom worried that I was becoming antisocial. My dating life was non-existent. But every time I felt tempted to give up, I'd think about Jake wincing as he pricked his finger for the third time that day, and I'd go back to work. I was methodical about everything. I documented every step of the development process in detailed lab notebooks, with dates, sketches, and photographs. I saved time-stamped files of every iteration of the design. I kept receipts for every component I purchased. Something in my engineering training had taught me that documentation was crucial, though at the time I thought it was just good scientific practice. I had no idea how important those records would become. After 8 months of nights and weekends, I had a working prototype. It was crude, held together with medical tape and prayers, but it worked. The patch could provide accurate glucose readings for 72 hours straight without any user intervention. The smartphone app displayed real-time data, historical trends, and predictive alerts. I tested it on myself first, then on volunteer friends, then on Jake. The results were remarkable. The accuracy matched expensive laboratory equipment, but the user experience was seamless. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I decided to propose GlucoSync as an official Phoenix Dynamics project. I should have been more careful. I should have protected myself better, but I was young and idealistic and still believed that innovation would be rewarded regardless of who created it. So I scheduled a meeting with Dr. Tricia Wells, our CEO, and prepared a presentation that would introduce GlucoSync to the company. The meeting went better than I'd dared to hope. Dr. Wells was immediately interested. She asked detailed questions about the technology, the market potential, and the development timeline. She seemed genuinely impressed that I'd built a working prototype on my own time. By the end of our hour-long discussion, she'd approved GlucoSync as an official company project with a dedicated budget and timeline. "Sarah," she said as I gathered my materials, "this could be exactly what Phoenix Dynamics needs to compete with the major players in this market. I'm putting you in charge of the technical development, and will assign a project manager to handle coordination and business strategy." I walked out of that meeting feeling like I was floating. My invention was going to become a real product. Phoenix Dynamics was going to invest in my vision. I was going to help millions of people like Jake live better lives. Everything was falling into place perfectly. That was my first mistake. For the next 3 months, I threw myself into refining GlucoSync with the resources of a real company behind me. The prototype became sleeker, more reliable, more manufacturable. I solved calibration issues that had been nagging at me for months. I optimized the wireless protocols to extend battery life even further. I worked with the regulatory team to ensure FDA compliance. Every day brought new improvements, new breakthroughs, new reasons to believe that GlucoSync would change the medical device industry. The project manager, Dr. Wells, had promised arrived in month 4. His name was Ryan Mitchell, and he seemed competent enough. MBA from UT Austin, experience in medical device marketing, enthusiastic attitude about the project's potential. During our first meeting, he asked intelligent questions about the technology and seemed genuinely interested in understanding how everything worked. "This is incredible, Sarah," he said, examining the latest prototype. "I can see why Dr. Wells is so excited. My job is going to be coordinating with manufacturing, regulatory affairs, and marketing to make sure we can bring this to market as efficiently as possible." Ryan seemed like exactly what the project needed. Someone to handle the business side while I focused on the technical development. He was friendly, professional, and respectful of my expertise. We established a good working rhythm. I'd update him on technical progress. He'd handle stakeholder communications and timeline management. It felt like a genuine partnership. That was my second mistake. Over the following months, I noticed small changes in how Ryan talked about the project. Initially, he'd referred to it as Sarah's invention, or the device Sarah developed. Gradually, those references became our project, and the technology we're building. I told myself it was just natural evolution. We were working together, so of course he'd start to feel ownership of the overall effort. But there were other signs I should have paid attention to. Ryan started attending technical meetings where his input wasn't really necessary. He'd ask me to explain basic concepts that any project manager in medical devices should have understood. He'd take detailed notes during my presentations to other departments. Then later I'd hear him repeating my explanations almost word for word to other colleagues. Most troubling, he began inserting himself into credit for technical decisions. When manufacturing asked about the micro-needle specifications, Ryan would say, "We designed them to be 3 millimeters deep to avoid nerve activation." When regulatory affairs inquired about wireless protocols, Ryan would explain our choice of Bluetooth low energy reduces power consumption by 80%. The work was still mine, but the credit was becoming ours. I told myself I was being paranoid. Collaborative projects naturally involved shared credit. Ryan was doing important work on the business side, and it made sense that he'd want to feel invested in the technical aspects too. As long as the project succeeded and helped people like Jake, did it really matter who got the recognition? That was my third and biggest mistake. By month 14, GlucoSync was ready for company-wide demonstration. We'd completed preliminary testing, solved the major technical hurdles, and received preliminary approval from our regulatory consultants for FDA submission. The device was no longer a prototype, it was a commercial-ready medical device that could revolutionize diabetes care. Dr. Wells scheduled the presentation for a Friday morning in November. The entire executive team would attend, along with key department heads and potential investors. This was the moment when GlucoSync would officially transition from development project to commercial product launch. I spent weeks preparing for that presentation. Every slide was perfect, every technical detail rehearsed, every potential question anticipated. I bought a new navy blazer that made me feel professional and confident. I practiced my delivery until I could explain the most complex technical concepts in language that non-engineers could understand. The night before the presentation, I stayed late in the lab, running final tests on the demonstration prototype. Everything was working flawlessly. The patch provided accurate readings. The wireless connection was stable. The smartphone app displayed beautiful real-time data. 18 months of work had culminated in a device that exceeded even my original vision. I went home that night feeling proud and nervous, and excited. Tomorrow the entire company would see what I'd built. Tomorrow I'd finally get the recognition I'd earned through countless late nights and weekend sacrifices. Tomorrow GlucoSync would officially become the... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Breakthrough innovation that would establish my career and help millions of diabetics. I had no idea that tomorrow would be the day my male colleague would stand in front of our entire executive team and explain my own invention to me as if I'd never seen it before. I had no idea that tomorrow would be the beginning of the most professionally humiliating experience of my life. And I definitely had no idea that tomorrow would also be the beginning of the most satisfying revenge I've ever orchestrated. But that part of the story starts with what happened when I walked into the conference room Friday morning, ready to present my life's work, only to discover that Ryan Mitchell had other plans entirely. Friday morning arrived crisp and clear, one of those perfect November days in Austin, where the temperature was just cool enough to make you feel alert and energized. I woke up at 5:30, an hour earlier than usual, not because I needed the extra time, but because I was too excited to sleep. Today was the day, after 18 months of development, GlucoSync would finally be presented to the people who mattered most at Phoenix Dynamics. I took extra care getting ready, selecting the navy blazer I'd bought specifically for this moment, and pairing it with a white blouse and my most comfortable heels. Professional but not trying too hard, confident but approachable. I wanted to look like someone who belonged in that boardroom, someone whose technical expertise commanded respect. I practiced my opening lines one more time in the bathroom mirror, then grabbed my laptop bag and headed for the office. Phoenix Dynamics was quiet at 6:15 in the morning. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars belonging to the early risers and workaholics who made up the engineering departments. I badged into the building and took the elevator down to my basement lab, where I spent an hour doing final checks on the demonstration prototype. The glucose readings were perfect, the wireless connection strong, the battery level optimal, everything was exactly as it should be. At 8 o'clock I carried my equipment up to Conference Room A, the largest meeting space on the third floor. The room was impressive in the way that corporate conference rooms try to be: polished wooden table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the Austin Hills, and a state-of-the-art presentation system that could handle any type of media. I connected my laptop to the projection system and ran through my slides one final time, making sure every transition was smooth and every graphic displayed properly. The GlucoSync prototype sat on the table in front of me, small and unassuming, but representing the most significant achievement of my career. The patch itself was barely larger than a quarter, its white surface hiding the sophisticated array of microneedles and sensors within. Connected wirelessly to my laptop, it was already providing real-time glucose readings from my own interstitial fluid, the numbers updating every 30 seconds on the large screen behind me. At 9:45 I heard voices in the hallway. Patricia Wells entered first, looking exactly as I'd expected: sharp business suit, confident stride, the bearing of someone accustomed to making important decisions. Behind her came Marcus Rodriguez, our VP of Product Development, a stocky man in his 50s, with graying hair and a reputation for asking tough technical questions. Jennifer Liu from marketing followed, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of focused expression that suggested she was already thinking about commercial applications. David Thompson, our chief technology officer, brought up the rear, his eyes immediately drawn to the prototype on the table. "Good morning, Sarah," Dr. Wells said warmly, settling into the chair directly across from me. "We're all very excited to see what you've been working on." I felt a flutter of nervous energy mixed with pride. These were the people who would decide GlucoSync's commercial future, and they were here because of work I had done, technology I had created, innovation I had brought to life through months of dedicated effort. "Thank you all for being here," I began, standing and moving toward the projection screen. "I'm thrilled to finally show you what GlucoSync can do for diabetic patients, and for Phoenix Dynamics' position in the continuous glucose monitoring market." That's when the conference room door opened again, and Ryan Mitchell walked in. He was slightly out of breath, as if he'd been hurrying, and his usually perfect hair was a bit disheveled. "Sorry I'm running late," he said, flashing that trademark smile around the room. Traffic was heavier than expected. Dr. Wells glanced at her watch. "No problem, Ryan. We were just getting started." I felt a small knot of confusion in my stomach. Ryan wasn't scheduled to be part of this presentation. We'd discussed it earlier in the week, and he'd agreed that since this was a technical demonstration, it made sense for me to handle it alone. His role was coordination and project management, not technical presentation, but I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe Wells had asked him to attend at the last minute. Maybe he wanted to be there for moral support. "Ready to show them what we've accomplished, Sarah?" Ryan asked, moving to stand beside me at the front of the room. "We've accomplished?" The phrase struck me as odd, but I nodded and turned back to the executives. "Absolutely. Let me start by explaining the problem we set out to solve." I launched into my carefully prepared introduction, explaining the limitations of current glucose monitoring technology and the daily challenges faced by diabetic patients. I talked about finger prick testing, the pain and inconvenience, the way it disrupted normal activity. I shared statistics about the size of the market and the unmet medical need. The executives listened attentively, taking notes and nodding at key points. "Now," I continued, clicking to my next slide, "let me show you how GlucoSync solves these problems through innovative microneedle technology and wireless connectivity." That's when Ryan stepped forward slightly, positioning himself more prominently in front of the table. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying that confident tone I'd heard him use in other meetings, "if you don't mind, I'd like to handle the technical explanation. I think I can present the innovations in a way that highlights the broader business implication." I blinked, my prepared words suddenly stuck in my throat. "Oh, but I've prepared a complete technical overview," Sarah's done excellent engineering work, Ryan continued, addressing the executives while barely glancing in my direction, but I think you'll appreciate a more strategic perspective on what makes this technology so revolutionary. Dr. Wells nodded approvingly. That makes sense, Ryan. Please, go ahead. I stood there for a moment, still holding the presentation remote, trying to process what was happening. This was my presentation, my technology, my 18 months of work. But somehow, in the span of 30 seconds, control had shifted to Ryan, and the executives seemed perfectly comfortable with the change. Ryan held out his hand expectantly, and after a moment of stunned hesitation, I gave him the remote. He clicked to the next slide, my slide, showing the microneedle array I had designed, and began speaking with the kind of authority typically reserved for subject matter experts. What I want to show you today, Ryan said, his voice filling the conference room, is a breakthrough approach to continuous glucose monitoring that will completely transform Phoenix Dynamics's position in this market. He clicked through my slides as if they were his own, each one representing weeks or months of my research and development. But as he spoke, something deeply unsettling began to happen. Ryan wasn't just presenting my work, he was explaining my own technology to me. The key innovation here, he said, gesturing toward the microneedle diagram, is the painless needle array. Sarah, you might find this particularly interesting from an engineering perspective. Each needle is precisely 3 millimeters deep, which allows us to sample interstitial fluid without activating pain receptors in the dermis. I stared at him, my mouth slightly open. I had calculated that exact depth specification. I had spent 2 weeks researching dermal anatomy to determine the optimal penetration distance. I had tested dozens of different needle configurations to find the perfect balance between fluid access and patient comfort. And now Ryan was explaining my own calculations to me, as if I was a student learning about the technology for the first time. The wireless connectivity is particularly clever, Ryan continued, advancing to my Bluetooth low-energy specification. Sarah, I'm sure you can appreciate the technical elegance here. Our implementation of BLEL protocol reduces power consumption by 80% compared to standard Bluetooth connections. I had spent 3 months researching wireless protocols, comparing power consumption profiles, testing different communication standards. I had personally written the firmware that optimized the BLEL connection for maximum efficiency. There was no hour in that development process. It had been entirely my work, my research, my solution to a complex technical challenge. But Ryan wasn't finished. As he moved through the presentation, he systematically took credit for every aspect of GlucoSync's development, while simultaneously explaining each innovation to me as if I was encountering it for the first time. The calibration algorithm was the real breakthrough, he said, clicking to my mathematical models and code snippet. Sarah, you probably didn't realize how complex this would be when we started. We had to develop a formula that accounts for temperature variation, skin impedance, and individual metabolic differences. I probably didn't realize I had developed that algorithm. I had spent 4 months working through the mathematics, running simulations, testing different approaches. I had personally collected data from volunteer test subjects to validate the calibration equation. I had debugged the code line by line, optimizing it for real-time performance on mobile devices. Every variable in that algorithm existed because I had identified its importance and incorporated it into the solution. Marcus Rodriguez leaned forward with obvious interest. Ryan, this is impressive work. How did you approach the FDA regulatory requirements? Excellent question, Ryan replied without missing a beat. Sarah, you might not be aware of this, but FDA Class II medical devices require very specific biocompatibility testing protocols and clinical validation studies. I might not be aware. I had spent 6 weeks navigating FDA documentation, reading guidance documents, consulting with regulatory specialists. I had personally contacted 3 different testing laboratories to discuss biocompatibility requirements. I had drafted the initial regulatory strategy, identifying every requirement that would need to be met for market approval. The compliance plan, currently sitting in the project folders, was based entirely on research I had conducted. Jennifer Liu from marketing raised her hand. What about the competitive landscape? How does this compare to existing solutions? Great point, Ryan said, clicking to my market analysis slides. Sarah, you might be interested to know that the global continuous glucose monitoring market is projected to reach $9 billion by 2025, with current solutions suffering from significant limitations. I might be interested. I had written that market analysis. I had researched every major competitor, analyzed their technical specifications, identified their weaknesses and market positioning. I had conducted the cost-benefit analysis that demonstrated GlucoSync's advantages over existing solutions. Those were my research notes, my competitive intelligence, my strategic insights being presented as if they were general knowledge I might find educationally valuable. David Thompson, the CTO, asked about manufacturing scalability. Ryan launched into an explanation of production cost estimates and supply chain considerations, once again addressing his response partially to me as if I was learning about manufacturing for the first time. But I had developed those cost estimates, I had researched component suppliers, analyzed manufacturing processes, calculated economies of scale. Every number he cited came from analysis I had performed. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, with Ryan systematically claiming credit for every aspect of GlucoSync, while simultaneously explaining my own work to me in increasingly condescending terms. He discussed the smartphone app interface I had designed, the data visualization features I had implemented, the user experience considerations I had researched. Each explanation was delivered with the implicit assumption that I was learning about these innovations, rather than having created them. The executives asked detailed questions, and Ryan answered with confidence, drawing on technical knowledge he had gained entirely from conversations with me over the past months. When Marcus asked about the microneedle manufacturing process, Ryan explained tolerances and materials I had researched. When Jennifer inquired about user testing results, Ryan cited data from studies I had conducted. When David wanted to know about battery life optimization, Ryan described firmware improvements I had implemented. Throughout the entire presentation, I stood beside the table like a junior engineer brought along to observe the proceedings. Occasionally, Ryan would gesture in my direction when acknowledging the technical team's contributions or Sarah's implementation work, but the clear narrative being established was that he was the visionary behind GlucoSync, while I was the technician who had executed his ideas. The most infuriating part wasn't just the credit theft, it was the way Ryan presented each innovation as if he was educating me about my own technology. His tone was that of a professor explaining concepts to a promising student, not a project manager discussing work created by a colleague. He would preface technical explanations with phrases like, "Sarah, you'll appreciate this complexity," or "as you probably know from an engineering perspective," or "this might be interesting from a technical standpoint," as if my role was to learn from his expertise rather than to explain technology I had invented. When the presentation finally ended, the conference room erupted in enthusiastic applause and congratulations, all directed toward Ryan. Dr. Wells beamed at him across the table. "Ryan, this is absolutely remarkable work. The commercial potential is enormous," Marcus Rodriguez nodded emphatically. "Outstanding innovation. You've identified a genuine market opportunity and developed technology that could dominate the space." Jennifer Liu was already taking notes about marketing strategies. "The positioning possibilities are endless. This could be a game changer for Phoenix Dynamics." David Thompson, as the CTO, focused on technical aspects. "The engineering is solid. Ryan, really impressive solution to a complex problem." Throughout the congratulations, I managed to maintain what I hoped was a professional smile. But inside I felt like I was drowning. 18 months of my life had just been rewritten as someone else's achievement. Every late night, every breakthrough moment, every technical challenge I had overcome, all of it was now attributed to a man who had joined the project 3 months ago, and whose primary contribution had been attending meetings and asking me to explain things to him. Ryan accepted the praise graciously, with appropriate humility about the team effort and collaborative process, but he made no attempt to correct the clear impression that GlucoSync was his innovation. When Dr. Wells specifically praised his technical vision. He simply smiled and said thank you. When Marcus commended his engineering insight, Ryan nodded appreciatively without mentioning that the insights had come from someone else. Sarah, Wells said as the meeting began to wind down, turning toward me with a warm but clearly secondary level of attention. Ryan's told us how valuable your technical support has been throughout this project. It's wonderful to see such effective collaboration between our business and engineering team. Technical support. Collaboration between business and engineering teams. As if I was the technician who had helped implement someone else's vision, rather than the inventor who had created the entire technology from scratch. Thank you, I managed to say, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. It's been a fascinating project to work on. Marcus gathered his papers and stood up. Ryan, let's schedule a follow-up meeting next week to discuss commercialization timeline and resource allocation. This is exactly the kind of innovation that could establish Phoenix Dynamics as a major player in this market. The executives filed out of the conference room, continuing to discuss GlucoSync's potential and praising Ryan's vision and leadership. I stayed behind, ostensibly to pack up the demonstration equipment, but really because I needed a moment to process what had just happened. Ryan lingered as well, and once we were alone, he turned to me with what I can only describe as a satisfied smile. That went really well, he said. I think they're genuinely excited about the commercial possibilities. I stared at him, searching for any sign of self-awareness, any acknowledgement of what he had just done. But his expression showed only the pleased satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed an important presentation. Ryan, I said carefully, my voice barely controlled. That was my presentation, my research, my technology. He looked genuinely puzzled. Sarah, come on, this is a collaborative project. Of course you did important technical work, but bringing something to market requires strategic thinking, business development, stakeholder management, all the things I've been handling. You explained my own invention to me, I said, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. You told me I might find it interesting to learn about technology I created. Ryan's expression shifted to what appeared to be genuine confusion, mixed with a hint of condescension. I was trying to include you in the conversation, to make sure the executives understood your contributions. You're a brilliant engineer, Sarah, but presentations to senior leadership require a different skill set. I was helping translate your technical work into language they could understand and appreciate. The audacity was breathtaking. He had stolen credit for my work, presented my innovations as his own insights, and explained my technology to me as if I was learning about it for the first time, and now he was framing it as helping me communicate with executives. Those weren't translations, those were my ideas, my research, my solutions being presented as yours, he sighed, the way you might sigh when dealing with someone who wasn't quite grasping an obvious point. Sarah, I understand you're emotionally invested in the technical aspects, but we need to think about what's best for the project overall. The executives respond better to business-focused presentations. They need to see the strategic vision, not just the engineering detail. The strategic vision based on market research I conducted, technical innovations I developed, regulatory analysis I performed, which I synthesized into a coherent business case. Ryan replied, his tone becoming slightly firmer. Look, Sarah, you're incredibly talented at what you do. The technical implementation has been excellent, but there's a difference between executing engineering tasks and leading a project that could transform the company's market position. I felt something cold and hard crystallizing in my chest. This wasn't miscommunication or misunderstanding. This was deliberate, calculated appropriation of my work, followed by gaslighting designed to make me question my own perceptions of what had happened. I need to get back to the lab, I said, not trusting myself to continue the conversation without saying something I might regret. Of course, Ryan said, already turning toward the door. Great work today, Sarah. The executives were really impressed with what we've accomplished. He walked out of the conference room with the same confident stride he'd entered with, leaving me alone with my laptop. my prototype, and the devastating realization that 18 months of my professional life had just been erased and rewritten as someone else's achievement. I sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs, staring at the glucosync prototype that continued to transmit my glucose readings to the laptop screen. The technology was exactly the same as it had been an hour earlier: innovative, breakthrough, revolutionary. But somehow, in the span of 45 minutes, it had stopped being mine. The worst part wasn't even the credit theft, though that was devastating enough. The worst part was the way Ryan had explained my own work to me, as if I was a student who might benefit from learning about advanced technology rather than the engineer who had invented it. The condescension was so complete, so systematic, that I wondered if he actually believed his own narrative, if he had somehow convinced himself that he was the innovator while I was merely the technician who had helped bring his vision to life. I packed up my equipment slowly, my hands shaking slightly with anger and humiliation. As I disconnected the prototype from my laptop, I noticed something I had missed during the emotional chaos of the presentation. The glucose readings displayed on my screen showed elevated stress hormones, hardly surprising given what I had just experienced, but somehow fitting that my own invention was documenting the physiological impact of having it stolen from me. Walking back to my basement lab, I passed several colleagues who offered congratulations about the successful presentation and praise for the innovative project. Word traveled fast in a company like Phoenix Dynamics, and apparently the narrative was already established. Ryan had developed breakthrough glucose monitoring technology and Sarah had provided valuable technical support. I spent the rest of the day in my lab, ostensibly working on routine tasks, but really trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. Every few minutes, I found myself replaying moments from the presentation, Ryan explaining my microneedle calculations to me, telling me I might find my own market research interesting, describing my algorithm as if he had developed it. Each memory felt like a physical blow. By evening, most of the building had emptied out, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my anger. I sat in my cramped workspace, surrounded by the equipment and prototypes that represented months of innovative work, and tried to figure out what to do next. I could complain to Wells, but Ryan had been careful to frame everything as collaborative effort rather than outright plagiarism. I could document what had really happened, but it would be my word against his, and he had just delivered a presentation that impressed the entire executive team. Or I could do something else entirely, something that would ensure this never happened to me again, and that Ryan would regret ever learning my name. That's when I remembered the folder on my laptop labeled Legal Protection, a collection of documents I had created months earlier during a moment of paranoia that now seemed like precedent. Inside that folder was something that would change everything. Something that would shift the power dynamics so completely that Ryan would wish he had never stepped foot in that conference room. But that part of the story would have to wait until Monday morning, when I would walk into Phoenix Dynamics and drop a bombshell that would turn Ryan's moment of triumph into the beginning of his professional destruction. Friday evenings stretched endlessly ahead of me as I sat in my basement lab, the fluorescent lights humming their monotonous tune above my head. The building had emptied hours ago, leaving me alone with the deafening silence of an office after hours and the crushing weight of what had transpired in conference room. My laptop screen glowed in the dim light, displaying the same glucosync readings it had been showing during the presentation, but now those numbers felt like evidence of a crime rather than proof of innovation. I should have poured myself a large glass of wine and tried to process the humiliation in the comfort of my apartment. Instead, I found myself opening that folder I'd labeled Legal Protection months earlier when some instinct I couldn't quite name had whispered that I needed to safeguard my work. At the time, it had felt like paranoia. Now it felt like the only thing standing between me and complete professional annihilation. The folder contained dozens of files, all meticulously organized and dated. Laboratory notebooks scanned into PDF format, showing my handwritten sketches and calculations from the earliest days of glucosync development. Time-stamped photographs of prototype iterations, each one clearly showing the evolution of my design process. Email correspondence with component suppliers, revealing the research and decision-making that had gone into every technical choice. Purchase receipts for materials I'd bought with my own money, proving that the initial development had happened on my own time and with my own resources. But buried deeper in the folder was something even more significant, a document I'd created during a sleepless night, 6 months earlier when Ryan's questions had started feeling less like curiosity and more like intelligence gathering. It was a provisional patent application filed through Lisa Park, an intellectual property attorney I'd found through MIT's alumni network. At the time, it had felt like insurance against an uncertain future. Now it looked like the key to everything. U.S. Provisional Patent Application 2024 Bio 1847, Wireless Glucose Monitoring System with Microneedle Array Technology, filed under the name Sarah Michelle Chen, inventor Sarah Michelle Chen, priority date, 6 months before Ryan Mitchell had ever heard of glucose. The provisional patent covered every innovative aspect of my technology, the precise microneedle configuration, the wireless protocol optimization, the calibration algorithms, even the user interface design. It was comprehensive, technically detailed and legally binding. More importantly, it established my claim to the invention months before Ryan had joined the project, creating an unshakable foundation for my ownership of the technology. I had filed it quietly, using my personal credit card to pay the attorney fees, and handling all correspondence through my private email account. The application included detailed technical specifications, laboratory test results, and photographic evidence of working prototypes. It was exactly the kind of documentation that patent attorneys dream of, clear, comprehensive, and undeniably authentic. Sitting in that empty office building, I realized that Ryan's presentation hadn't just been an act of professional theft, it had been a declaration of war. And fortunately for me, I had been preparing for this battle longer than he knew. The weekend passed in a blur of strategic planning and emotional processing. Saturday morning, I drove to Doc Park's office in downtown Austin, a sleek building near the Capitol where intellectual property attorneys helped inventors protect their life's work from exactly the kind of appropriation I had just experienced. Doc Park was a sharp woman in her 40s with gray-streaked hair and the kind of focused intensity that made you feel confident about tackling complex legal challenges. "Sarah," she said, as I settled into the chair across from her desk, "when you filed this provisional patent, did you anticipate something like this happening?" I thought about the question carefully. Not exactly this, but I had a feeling that working at a larger company meant my individual contributions might get obscured. I wanted to make sure I could prove what I had created. Dr. Park nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. The provisional patent establishes your priority date and gives us a solid foundation for moving forward. Based on what you've told me about yesterday's presentation, we have several options." She outlined the possibilities with the kind of clinical precision that lawyers use when discussing other people's life-changing decisions. We could convert the provisional patent to a full utility patent, establishing permanent legal protection for my technology. We could send a cease and desist letter to Phoenix Dynamics, demanding acknowledgement of my intellectual property rights. We could pursue a federal lawsuit for patent infringement and misappropriation of trade secrets. "What I recommend," Park said, leaning back in her leather chair, "is a multi-pronged approach that protects your interests while giving Phoenix Dynamics an opportunity to resolve this professionally before it becomes a public legal battle." We spent the next 2 hours crafting a strategy that was both legally sound and strategically brilliant. Dr. Park would immediately file the full utility patent application, including additional claims based on refinements I'd made during my time at Phoenix Dynamics. She would prepare a formal cease and desist letter establishing my ownership of the technology and demanding that all company communications acknowledge my role as the inventor. Most importantly, she would draft a licensing proposal that would allow Phoenix Dynamics to continue developing GlucoSync while compensating me appropriately for my intellectual property. "The key," Park explained as we reviewed the documents, "is to position this as a business opportunity rather than just a legal threat. Phoenix Dynamics invested resources in refining your technology, but you own the fundamental innovations that make it valuable. A licensing agreement benefits everyone involved. By Saturday evening, I had a comprehensive legal strategy and a timeline for implementation, but I also had something even more valuable: clarity about what had really happened and confidence that I had the tools to address it effectively. Ryan hadn't just stolen credit for my work, he had unknowingly declared war on someone who had been preparing for exactly this battle. Sunday, I spent the day at my apartment, going through every email, document, and file related to GlucoSync development. I organized everything chronologically, creating an ironclad timeline that demonstrated my role as the sole inventor of the technology. The evidence was overwhelming. Every breakthrough, every technical decision, every innovative solution could be traced back to my research and development work. I also did something that felt both satisfying and slightly vindictive. I researched Ryan Mitchell's background more thoroughly than I had when he'd first joined the project. His LinkedIn profile painted a picture of someone who had built his career by attaching himself to successful projects without necessarily contributing to their technical foundation. His previous positions all involved project coordination and strategic oversight rather than actual innovation or development work. More revealing were the recommendations on his profile, which consistently praised his ability to synthesize complex technical information and talent for translating engineering concepts into business strategy. In other words, Ryan had made a career out of taking other people's technical work and repackaging it as his own strategic insight. The pattern was clear, and I realized that what had happened to me on Friday was not an impulsive decision, but a calculated move by someone who had successfully pulled off similar maneuvers throughout his professional life. The only difference was that this time his target had been smart enough to protect herself in advance. Monday morning arrived gray and rainy, matching my mood as I prepared for what would either be the most satisfying or most career-ending day of my professional life. I dressed carefully, selecting a charcoal suit that made me feel authoritative and confident. Today, I would not be the quiet engineer who got steamrolled in meetings. Today, I would be the inventor protecting her intellectual property with the full force of the legal system behind her. I arrived at Phoenix Dynamics at my usual time, 6:15 in the morning, and went straight to my lab to prepare for what was coming. Dr. Park had scheduled the document delivery for 8 o'clock sharp when the executive team would be in their offices, but before the normal chaos of Monday morning meetings could provide distraction. At exactly 8 o'clock, I sent 3 carefully crafted emails from my personal account to avoid any possibility that Phoenix Dynamics could claim my correspondence was company property. The first email went to Dr. Patricia Wells, with copies to Marcus Rodriguez, David Thompson, and the company's legal department. The subject line was deliberately stark: intellectual property rights, GlucoSync technology. The body was professional but unambiguous. Dr. Wells, I am writing to inform you that the glucose monitoring technology demonstrated on Friday, November 15th, is protected by provisional patent application filed under my name, 6 months prior to Phoenix Dynamics' involvement with the project. The attached documentation establishes my individual ownership of all core innovations, including, but not limited to, the microneedle array design, wireless protocol optimization, and calibration algorithms. I have instructed my attorney to file a full utility patent application immediately. I remain committed to Phoenix Dynamics' success and am prepared to discuss licensing arrangements that would allow continued development while appropriately recognizing and compensating my intellectual property rights. The second email went directly to Ryan Mitchell, with a copy to Marcus Rodriguez. The subject line was more pointed: patent protection notice, GlucoSync technology. The message was brief and legally precise. Ryan, I need to inform you that the technology presented during Friday's demonstration is protected intellectual property under provisional patent application 20. All core innovations were developed prior to your involvement with the project and are legally owned by me as the inventor. Please immediately cease any claims of co-development or shared ownership until this matter can be resolved through appropriate legal channel. The third email went to the GlucoSync development team and project stakeholders, establishing a clear record of the true development timeline. I attached comprehensive documentation, timestamped, and files, laboratory notes, photographic evidence, and email correspondence that painted an undeniable picture of my role as the sole inventor of the technology. After sending the emails, I walked calmly to the break room to pour myself a cup of coffee, then returned to my lab to wait for the explosion I knew was coming. I didn't have to wait long. My phone started ringing at 8:23. Ryan's name appeared on the screen, and I could practically feel his panic through the device. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message, a rambling, increasingly frantic explanation of how this was all a misunderstanding, how we were partners, how patents couldn't be filed on collaborative work. The second call came from Marcus Rodriguez, at 8:35. His tone was more controlled but no less urgent. "Sarah, we need to discuss this situation immediately. Can you come to my office?" "I'll be there in 10 minutes, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Walking through the Phoenix Dynamics corridors that Monday morning felt different than it ever had before. I wasn't the quiet engineer hoping for recognition. I was the patent holder who controlled the company's most promising new technology. My heels clicked confidently on the polished floors as I made my way to the executive wing, passing colleagues, who were already whispering about the emails that had apparently spread through the company like wildfire. Marcus Rodriguez's office was larger and more impressive than the basement lab where I'd spent the past 18 months, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Austin skyline and furniture that probably cost more than my annual salary. But today the expensive decor couldn't hide the fact that the man behind the desk looked like someone who had just discovered a massive problem with no easy solution. "Sarah," Marcus said as I entered, his usual confidence replaced by barely controlled concern, "help me understand what's happening here. Are you claiming to own technology developed during company time with company resources?" I sat down across from him, placing my folder of documentation on his desk with deliberate precision. "I'm claiming to own technology I invented on my own time, with my own resources, using my own equipment, before Phoenix Dynamics ever knew it existed. But the project has been funded by company resources for months. We've invested significant capital in development and refinement. You've invested in improving and commercializing technology I already own. Phoenix Dynamics has made valuable contributions to making GlucoSync market-ready, but the fundamental innovations that make it revolutionary are mine." Marcus opened my folder and began reviewing the documents, patent applications, time-stamped files, laboratory notebooks, purchase receipts, email correspondence. His expression grew increasingly troubled as the evidence mounted. "Sarah, even if the initial development was done independently, your employment contract assigns intellectual property rights to the company for any inventions created during your tenure here." I had anticipated this argument and prepared for it carefully. "My employment contract grants Phoenix Dynamics rights to inventions developed using company resources during company time, but my provisional patent was filed 2 months before the effective date of that contract, establishing prior art that predates any assignment agreement." Marcus leaned back in his chair, clearly recognizing that he was dealing with someone who had thought through the legal implications much more carefully than he had initially assumed. "What exactly are you asking for, Sarah?" "Recognition of my intellectual property, acknowledgement in all company communications that I am the inventor of GlucoSync technology, and a licensing agreement that fairly compensates me for the use of my patents, while allowing Phoenix Dynamics to continue development and commercialization. And if we refuse," I met his gaze steadily, "then Phoenix Dynamics will discover that its most promising new product is based on technology the company doesn't own and can't legally use without my permission." The rest of our conversation was brief and professional, but the underlying dynamic had shifted completely. Marcus was no longer the executive, explaining company policy to a subordinate engineer. He was a business leader, trying to negotiate with someone who held significant leverage over his company's future. As I walked back to my lab, I passed Ryan in the hall. He looked like a man who had spent the morning realizing that his moment of triumph had become the beginning of his professional nightmare. Our eyes met briefly and I saw something I had never seen in Ryan Mitchell's expression before: fear. The rest of Monday passed in a series of urgent meetings and hushed conversations throughout Phoenix Dynamics. Word had spread quickly that the quiet engineer in the basement lab owned patents on the company's breakthrough technology,
and that the impressive presentation everyone had been talking about might not have been quite what it seemed. By late afternoon, I had received a formal meeting request from Dr. Wells herself, scheduled for the following morning in the main conference room, where Ryan had stolen my presentation just 4 days earlier. The subject line read simply, "GlucoSync Development Discussion, All Stakeholders." As I packed up my things that evening preparing to leave Phoenix Dynamics for what might be one of the last times as a regular employee, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Friday morning: anticipation. Tomorrow's meeting would determine whether my weekend of strategic planning had been worth it, whether my months of careful documentation would pay off, and whether Ryan Mitchell would finally understand what it felt like to have someone else control his professional destiny. The weekend of realization was over. The week of reckoning was about to begin. Tuesday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crisp November day that makes you feel sharp and alert. I woke before my alarm dressed in my most professional suit, a midnight black ensemble that made me feel like I was preparing for battle, and arrived at Phoenix Dynamics with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before Ryan Mitchell had stolen my presentation 5 days earlier. The building buzzed with an undercurrent of tension that was palpable from the moment I badged through the front entrance. Melissa at the reception desk gave me a look that was part curiosity, part admiration, as if she was seeing me for the first time despite the fact that I'd walked past her desk every morning for 18 months. Word travels fast in a company of 200 people, and by now everyone knew that the quiet engineer from the basement lab was at the center of a corporate storm. Conference room A had been transformed for this meeting. Instead of the casual setup from Friday's presentation, the room now resembled a negotiation between opposing legal teams. Dr. Tricia Wells sat at the head of the polished table, flanked by Jessica Carter from legal and an older man I didn't recognize who wore the unmistakable bearing of an expensive attorney.
Marcus Rodriguez occupied one side of the table with David Thompson and 2 other executives I vaguely knew from company-wide meetings. Ryan Mitchell sat near the far end of the table, looking smaller and more subdued than I'd ever seen him. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by something that resembled barely controlled panic. He avoided eye contact as I entered the room, instead focusing intently on a legal pad covered with what appeared to be hastily scribbled notes. Dr. Park had arrived 20 minutes before me and was already seated with her own array of documents spread precisely in front of her. She gave me a subtle nod as I took the chair beside her, and I felt the reassurance that comes from having someone truly competent on your side. "Thank you all for being here," Dr. Wells began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that this meeting would determine the future of her company's most promising technology. "We're here to discuss the intellectual property questions that have arisen regarding GlucoSync technology and to find a path forward that serves everyone's interests." Jessica Carter opened a thick folder and addressed the room with the kind of careful precision that lawyers use when they know they're walking through a minefield. "We've reviewed the documentation provided by Ms. Chen, and we acknowledge that her provisional patent application predates Phoenix Dynamics' involvement with GlucoSync development." The admission hung in the air like a small explosion. Several of the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Ryan's face went pale. Park leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but authoritative. "The evidence is quite clear. Ms. Chen filed provisional patent application 2024 Bio 1847, 6 months before Phoenix Dynamics began funding this project. The application covers all core innovations that make GlucoSync revolutionary: the micro-needle array design, the wireless optimization protocols, and the calibration algorithms." Marcus Rodriguez spoke up, his tone suggesting he was still hoping to find a way out of this situation. But surely the refinements and improvements made during company time would be considered collaborative development. "Improvements to patented technology don't create ownership rights," Dr. Park replied smoothly. "Phoenix Dynamics has made valuable contributions to commercializing Ms. Chen's invention, but the fundamental intellectual property remains hers." David Thompson, as CTO, tried a different approach. "Sarah, help us understand your timeline here. When exactly did you develop the core technology?" I had prepared for this question extensively, and I opened my laptop to display a comprehensive timeline that Dr. Park and I had refined over the weekend. The initial concept and prototype development occurred between March and September of last year, entirely on my personal time, using my own equipment. I have time-stamped files, laboratory notebooks, and purchase receipts that document every stage of development. The timeline appeared on the large screen behind me, showing month-by-month progress through the invention process. Each milestone was supported by multiple forms of evidence, photographs of early prototypes, dated email correspondence with suppliers, even credit card receipts for components I'd purchased. As you can see, I continued, clicking through the documentation. The micro-needle specifications were finalized in April. The wireless protocol was optimized in May. The calibration algorithm was completed in July. All of this occurred before I ever proposed GlucoSync as a company project. Ryan finally spoke, his voice strained and defensive. But Sarah, we collaborated on this. I brought strategic insights, market analysis, business development expertise. Market analysis I researched and wrote. I interrupted, clicking to email timestamps that showed my authorship of every document he was claiming. Business development, based on supplier relationships I established. Strategic insights derived from technical briefings I provided. Dr. Park added, with surgical precision. Mr. Mitchell, our review of the project documentation shows no original contributions from you to the patentable aspects of this technology. Project management and coordination, while valuable, don't create intellectual property rights. The room fell silent as the full implications of the situation became clear to everyone present. Phoenix Dynamics had built their commercialization strategy around technology they didn't own, and the person who did own it was sitting at their conference table with a patent attorney and 18 months of documented evidence. Dr. Wells finally addressed the elephant in the room. Sarah, what are you looking for here? What would it take to resolve this situation? I had spent considerable time preparing for this moment, and I delivered my response with the kind of calm authority that comes from holding all the winning cards. I want 3 things. First, public acknowledgement from Phoenix Dynamics that I am the inventor of GlucoSync technology. This includes correcting any communications, presentations, or documents that have misattributed the invention to others. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly understanding that this demand would publicly expose his credit theft. Second, I continued, I want a formal licensing agreement that compensates me appropriately for Phoenix Dynamics' use of my patented technology. My attorney has prepared a proposal that includes both upfront licensing fees and ongoing royalties based on commercial sales. Dr. Park slid a document across the table to Jessica Carter, who began reviewing it immediately. Third, I want assurance that Phoenix Dynamics will implement policies to prevent this situation from occurring again. Clear attribution guidelines, proper documentation of individual contributions, and protection for employees whose innovations drive company success. Marcus Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, clearly calculating the financial implications. Sarah, these terms seem quite aggressive for someone who has been an employee throughout the development process. These terms reflect the market value of breakthrough medical device technology. Park interjected. Ms. Chen's innovations have the potential to generate hundreds of millions in revenue. The licensing proposal is actually quite reasonable given the commercial potential. David Thompson asked the question that everyone was thinking. What happens if we don't agree to these terms? I looked directly at him, my voice steady and unmistakable. Then Phoenix Dynamics will find itself unable to commercialize, manufacture, or sell GlucoSync technology without facing federal patent infringement litigation. The technology you've been planning to launch doesn't belong to you. The silence that followed was deafening. For several long moments, the only sound in the room was the quiet humming of the ventilation system, and the occasional rustle of papers as the attorneys reviewed documents. Jessica Carter finally spoke. We'll need time to review the licensing proposal with our executive team and board of directors. This represents a significant financial commitment. Of course, Dr. Park replied, but I should mention that we've received inquiries from other medical device companies who are interested in licensing Ms. Chen's technology. Time is a factor if Phoenix Dynamics wants to maintain its competitive advantage. This was news to me. but I managed to keep my expression neutral. As Park revealed what was apparently her strategic masterstroke, the implication was clear. Phoenix Dynamics could either negotiate a reasonable licensing agreement or watch their breakthrough technology go to a competitor. Dr. Wells asked for a 15-minute recess, during which the Phoenix Dynamics team huddled at one end of the conference room while Dr. Park and I reviewed our strategy at the other end. I could see intense discussions, occasional glances in our direction, and what appeared to be some very uncomfortable questions being directed at Ryan. When the meeting reconvened, Dr. Wells had clearly reached a decision. "Sarah, we're prepared to accept your terms in principle, subject to finalizing the specific details of the licensing agreement." The relief I felt was overwhelming, but I managed to maintain my professional composure. "I'm glad we can find a mutually beneficial solution. However," Dr. Wells continued, her tone becoming more serious, "we also need to address the misrepresentation that occurred during Friday's presentation. The board expects a full accounting of how this situation developed." All eyes turned to Ryan, who looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Marcus Rodriguez took the lead in what was clearly a conversation the executive team had already discussed. "Ryan, based on our review of the project documentation and timeline, it appears that significant errors were made in representing the development history and individual contributions to glucosync technology." Ryan's response was barely audible. I believed that as project manager, I had collaborative ownership of the strategic and technical decisions. "Project management doesn't create intellectual property rights," Jessica Carter stated flatly, "and misrepresenting someone else's inventions as your own innovations is a serious professional and legal issue." Dr. Park leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, are you acknowledging that the technical innovations you presented on Friday were actually developed by Ms. Chen?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Ryan looked around the room, perhaps hoping for support that wasn't coming, then finally nodded. "Yes, Sarah developed the core technology. I was responsible for project coordination and business strategy." "Business strategy based on market research Ms. Chen conducted," Dr. Park added, not letting him off the hook. "And project coordination of technology, Ms. Chen invented." The formal acknowledgement was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. For 5 days I had wondered if I was overreacting, if perhaps I was being too sensitive about credit and recognition. But hearing Ryan admit, in front of the entire executive team, that he had taken credit for my innovations, validated everything I had felt and fought for. Dr. Wells addressed Ryan directly. "Ryan, effective immediately, you're being removed from the GlucoSync project. HR will meet with you this afternoon to discuss next steps regarding your employment with Phoenix Dynamics." The meeting concluded with handshakes and agreements to finalize the licensing documentation within the week. As the room emptied, Ryan approached me with what appeared to be a mixture of shame and desperation. "Sarah, I want you to know that I never meant for things to happen this way. I got caught up in the excitement of the project, and maybe took more credit than I deserved." I looked at him for a long moment, thinking about everything that had led to this confrontation. "Ryan, you didn't accidentally take credit. You systematically presented my work as your own innovations, while explaining my technology to me as if I was learning about it for the first time. That wasn't excitement. That was deliberate appropriation." He stood there for a moment, perhaps hoping for forgiveness or understanding that wasn't coming, then walked away without another word. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal documentation, contract negotiations, and corporate communication. Phoenix Dynamics issued a formal statement acknowledging my role as the inventor of glucosync technology, and the company's website was updated to properly attribute the innovation. The licensing agreement was finalized with terms that exceeded even Park's initial projections, including both substantial upfront payments and percentage royalties on all future sales. But the most satisfying development came 3 weeks after the confrontation. Dr. Wells called me into her office with an unexpected proposal. "Sarah, the board has been discussing your situation extensively, and we've realized that we made a serious error in how your contributions were recognized and managed. We'd like to offer you the position of Director of Innovation, with full authority over R&D projects and a compensation package that reflects your value to the company. The offer was generous, nearly double my previous salary, stock options, and most importantly, creative control over my research with guaranteed attribution for my innovations. It was everything I had wanted 18 months earlier when I'd first started developing glucosync. I appreciate the offer, Dr. Wells, but I've actually decided to pursue other opportunities. Her surprise was evident. Other opportunities. During the weeks of legal negotiations, word had spread through the medical device industry about the engineer who had successfully defended her patent rights against corporate appropriation. I had received calls from 3 different companies, including MedTech Solutions in Dallas, BioInnovate in Houston, and even a startup offer from former colleagues who wanted to build a company around my innovations. I've accepted a position as Chief Technology Officer at MedTech Solutions. They're offering me the opportunity to lead a team of engineers, maintain ownership rights to my inventions, and develop next-generation medical devices that build on the glucosync platform. Dr. Wells looked genuinely disappointed. Sarah, I hope you understand that what happened with Ryan was an aberration. Phoenix Dynamics values innovation and wants to support inventors like you. I'm sure that's true, I replied diplomatically, but I've learned that the best way to protect my work is to choose environments where my contributions will be recognized from the beginning, not after I have to fight for them. My last day at Phoenix Dynamics was nothing like the devastating humiliation I had experienced 3 weeks earlier. Colleagues stopped by my lab to congratulate me on my new position and to express admiration for how I had handled the entire situation. Several mentioned that my success had already led to policy changes in how the company attributed individual contributions to collaborative projects. As I packed my personal belongings, I reflected on how dramatically my professional life had changed in such a short time. 3 weeks earlier, I had been the quiet engineer whose innovations were stolen and whose expertise was dismissed. Now I was the patent-holding CTO who had successfully defended her intellectual property and landed her dream job with a company that valued innovation over politics. 6 months later, I was settling into my new office at MedTech Solutions, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows and my name prominently displayed on the door, when I received an unexpected LinkedIn message. It was from a young woman named Jennifer Martinez, a biomedical engineer at a startup in California. Dr. Chen, I heard about your situation at Phoenix Dynamics through industry contacts. I'm facing a similar issue where my male supervisor is taking credit for a medical device I developed. I filed a provisional patent based on your story, and I'm wondering if you could recommend the attorney who helped you. Your success has inspired me to fight for what's mine. I smiled as I typed my response, providing Park's contact information and encouraging Jennifer to document everything carefully. Over the following months, I received similar messages from other women engineers, each facing their own version of credit theft and professional appropriation. That's when I realized that my confrontation with Ryan Mitchell had been about more than just protecting my own intellectual property. It had been about establishing a precedent that brilliant women wouldn't silently accept having their innovations stolen, their expertise dismissed, or their contributions erased. A year after leaving Phoenix Dynamics, I was invited to speak at the Austin Women in Technology Leadership Conference. The auditorium was packed with engineers, entrepreneurs, and innovators who reminded me of myself at the beginning of this journey, talented women who deserved recognition for their contributions, but weren't always getting it. 18 months ago, I began looking out at the audience. A male colleague explained my own invention to me in a boardroom full of executives as if I was learning about technology I had created. He took credit for every breakthrough, every innovation, every solution I had developed through months of dedicated work. I clicked to a photo of the GlucoSync prototype, the same device that had started this entire journey. Today, that technology is protected by U.S. Patent 11-847-293, issued to Sarah Michelle Chen. The company that allowed my credit to be stolen is paying me substantial licensing fees to use technology they never understood. And I'm here as the CTO of a company that recognizes innovation the first time, not after you have to sue for recognition. The applause was enthusiastic, but more importantly,
I could see recognition in the faces looking back at me. These were women who understood exactly what I had experienced, who had their own stories of dismissed expertise and stolen credit. The most important lesson I learned isn't about patent law or intellectual property rights, I continued. It's that documentation is power, evidence is protection, and sometimes the most important person to advocate for your work is yourself. After my presentation, I was approached by dozens of women with their own stories, engineers whose innovations had been attributed to male colleagues, entrepreneurs whose business ideas had been appropriated by partners, researchers whose discoveries had been claimed by supervisors. Each conversation reinforced my understanding that what had happened to me wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern that brilliant women face throughout their careers. That evening, as I drove home through Austin traffic, I thought about Ryan Mitchell. I had heard through industry contacts that he'd struggled to find another position after Phoenix Dynamics, as word of the patent dispute had spread through the medical device community. His LinkedIn profile showed a series of short-term consulting positions, none lasting more than a few months. I didn't feel satisfaction at his professional struggles, but I did feel vindicated that there had been consequences for his actions. More importantly, I felt proud that my willingness to fight had potentially prevented him from doing the same thing to other women engineers. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother Jake. Saw your conference presentation online, Sarah. The new glucose monitor you developed at MedTech is incredible. No more finger pricks for me. You literally changed my life, and you did it with your name on the patent where it belonged. That message reminded me why I had started this journey in the first place. GlucoSync technology was now helping thousands of diabetics monitor their blood sugar without pain or inconvenience. The second-generation devices I was developing at MedTech Solutions were even more advanced, incorporating artificial intelligence and predictive analytics that could prevent diabetic emergencies before they occur. But beyond the technology itself, I had created something else, a template for how brilliant women could protect their innovations and fight for recognition in industries that often overlooked their contribution. The patent application I had filed in a moment of paranoia had become the foundation for a new career, a licensing empire, and a platform for inspiring other women to defend their intellectual property. The little girl who had dreamed of becoming an inventor had grown up to become exactly that, and no one would ever be able to take that achievement away from her again. More importantly, I had proven that with preparation, documentation, and the courage to fight for what's yours, even the most devastating professional betrayal can become the foundation for something greater than you originally imagined. The mansplainer had been defeated, the patent had been protected, and the lawsuit had been won, but the real victory was knowing that every woman who heard this story might be a little more prepared to protect her own innovations from those who would try to steal them. 2 years after walking out of Phoenix Dynamics with my head held high and my patent firmly in hand, I stood in the gleaming lobby of MedTech Solutions' new headquarters in Dallas, watching my name being etched in gold letters on the building directory. Sarah Chen, Chief Technology Officer and Head of Innovation. The sight still gave me chills, not because of the title itself, but because of everything it represented: a career built on my own terms, recognition earned rather than stolen, and innovations that bore my name from day one. The transformation had been remarkable, not just for me personally but for the entire trajectory of my professional life. What had started as a devastating betrayal at Phoenix Dynamics had become the catalyst for building something far greater than I had ever imagined possible. The patent that I'd filed in a moment of paranoid foresight had evolved into a portfolio of intellectual property that was reshaping the medical device industry. MedTech Solutions had given me something Phoenix Dynamics never could: complete creative freedom combined with unshakable attribution rights. When they recruited me 18 months earlier, the contract negotiations had been unlike anything I'd experienced. Instead of the standard employment agreement that would have transferred all my innovations to the company, we crafted a unique arrangement where I retained co-ownership of any patents filed during my tenure, with MedTech receiving exclusive licensing rights, and me receiving substantial royalty. "We're not just hiring an engineer," CEO Michael Davidson had explained during our initial discussions, we're partnering with an innovator whose work has the potential to transform how we approach chronic disease management. Your success is our success, and we want to make sure you're appropriately rewarded for the value you create. The philosophy was revolutionary in an industry where individual contributors typically saw their innovations absorbed into corporate portfolios without additional compensation. But MedTech understood something that Phoenix Dynamics had learned too late. Truly breakthrough technology comes from individuals who feel valued and protected, not from those who fear having their work appropriated. My first year at MedTech had been a whirlwind of development and discovery. Building on the GlucoSync platform, I had assembled a team of 12 engineers and researchers to develop what we called the BioSense family of continuous monitoring devices. The original glucose monitor had been just the beginning. We were now working on continuous monitoring solutions for blood pressure, cardiac rhythm, hydration levels, and even early cancer biomarkers. The crown jewel of our current development was the MetaSync system, a comprehensive health monitoring platform that could track dozens of biomarkers simultaneously through a single, nearly invisible patch. The technology represented a quantum leap beyond anything currently available, using advanced nanotechnology sensors and machine learning algorithms to provide real-time health analytics that could predict medical emergencies days before they occur. Sarah, the FDA meeting is in 30 minutes, my assistant Elena reminded me as I stood in the lobby reflecting on the journey. The regulatory team is already assembled in conference room C. The FDA presentation was a milestone I had been working toward for 8 months. MetaSync represented such a significant advancement in medical monitoring technology that it required a completely new regulatory framework. Today's meeting would determine whether our innovation would be fast-tracked for approval or subjected to years of additional testing and documentation. Walking through MedTech's corridors felt completely different from navigating Phoenix Dynamics hallways. Here my contributions were celebrated and amplified rather than diminished or stolen. The walls displayed patents and innovations from various team members with clear attribution and recognition for individual achievements. My own section included not just the original GlucoSync patent, but 5 additional filings that had emerged from our ongoing research. Conference room C was filled with familiar faces. My engineering team, regulatory specialist, clinical researchers and marketing strategist, who had become collaborators rather than competitors. At the head of the table sat Dr. Amanda Foster, the FDA's Director of Medical Device Innovation, along with 3 other regulatory officials who would determine MetaSync's pathway to market. Dr. Foster began with a warm smile. We've reviewed your submission materials extensively, and I have to say, the potential implications of MetaSync technology are remarkable. Walk us through the clinical validation. For the next 2 hours I presented the most comprehensive medical device validation study in my career. MetaSync had been tested on over 3,000 patients across 15 medical centers, with results that exceeded even our most optimistic projection. The system could detect early signs of heart attacks, strokes, diabetic emergencies and kidney dysfunction with accuracy rates above 95%. The real breakthrough, I explained, displaying comparative data on the large screen, isn't just the monitoring capability, it's the predictive analytics. MetaSync doesn't just tell patients what's happening to their health right now, it tells them what's likely to happen in the next 72 hours, based on current biomarker trends. Dr. Foster leaned forward with obvious interest. The implications for preventive medicine are extraordinary. How soon could this technology be available for widespread deployment? With expedited approval, I replied, we could begin limited market release within 18 months, and full commercial availability within 2 years. The FDA team exchanged glances that suggested they were as excited about MetaSync's potential as we were. After additional technical discussions and regulatory clarifications, Dr. Foster delivered the news we had been hoping for. Based on the clinical evidence and the potential public health impact, We're recommending MetaSync for our breakthrough device designation program. This will significantly accelerate the approval timeline and provide ongoing regulatory support throughout the development process. The achievement was monumental, representing not just regulatory validation, but recognition that my innovations were genuinely transformative rather than merely incremental improvements. As the FDA team gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Dr. Foster approached me personally. Dr. Chin, I've been working in medical device regulation for 15 years, and I rarely see technology that has the potential to fundamentally change how we approach healthcare. MetaSync represents exactly the kind of innovation that the FDA exists to support and expedite. After the meeting concluded, I found myself back in my office, staring out at the Dallas skyline, and reflecting on how dramatically my professional life had changed. The shy engineer who had once worked in a basement lab, hoping for recognition that never came, had evolved into the CTO of a major medical device company, with patents worth millions and innovations that could save lives worldwide. My phone buzzed with a text from Jake. Saw the FDA news on your company's stock price jumped 12% after the announcement. My big sister is changing the world one patent at a time. Jake's message reminded me of why I had started this journey in the first place. He was now using third-generation GlucoSync technology that provided seamless, painless blood glucose monitoring with accuracy that surpassed traditional testing methods. But more importantly, he had become an advocate for other diabetics, speaking at conferences about how continuous monitoring technology had transformed his quality of life. The financial success had been substantial but almost secondary to the personal satisfaction.
My original Phoenix Dynamics licensing agreement continued to generate significant royalties as their version of GlucoSync gained market share. The patents I'd filed during my time at MedTech were already being licensed to other companies, creating multiple revenue streams that provided financial independence I had never imagined possible. But perhaps the most meaningful development had been the platform I'd inadvertently created for other women facing similar challenges. The story of my confrontation with Ryan Mitchell had spread throughout the engineering community, becoming a cautionary tale for companies and an inspiration for individual inventors. Dr. Chin? Elena's voice came through my office intercom. There's a Jennifer Martinez here to see you. She says you've been corresponding about intellectual property issues. Jennifer Martinez was the biomedical engineer from California who had contacted me months earlier about her own credit theft situation. Following my advice, she had documented her innovations, filed provisional patents, and successfully defended her intellectual property against a supervisor who had tried to claim her work. Now she was here in Dallas for reasons I was about to discover. Chen, Jennifer said as she settled into the chair across from my desk, I can't thank you enough for the guidance you provided during my patent dispute. Your story gave me the courage to fight for what was mine. I'm glad it worked out, I replied. How did your situation resolve? Better than I could have hoped. My company ended up offering me a promotion and substantial compensation for licensing my patents, but that's actually why I'm here. I have a proposition. Jennifer opened her laptop and displayed a presentation that immediately captured my attention. She had developed a revolutionary approach to non-invasive cancer detection using biomarker analysis that could identify malignancies months before current diagnostic methods. The technology is breakthrough, she continued, but I've learned from your experience that innovation without proper legal protection and strategic partnerships can be vulnerable to appropriation. I want to propose a collaborative arrangement where we combine our technologies and build something even more significant together. The proposal was intriguing on multiple levels. Jennifer's cancer detection technology could integrate seamlessly with MetaSync's continuous monitoring platform, creating a comprehensive health surveillance system that could predict and prevent a wide range of medical emergencies. More importantly, she had approached the collaboration with the kind of intellectual property awareness that I had learned through painful experience. What kind of arrangement are you envisioning? I asked. Joint patent filings with shared ownership and cross-licensing agreement. Each of us maintains control over our core innovations while benefiting from the combined platform. Most importantly, everything is documented and attributed from the beginning. Over the following weeks, Jennifer and I worked with our respective legal teams to craft what became known as the Chen-Martinez Medical Innovation Partnership. The agreement established a new model for collaborative technology development that protected individual contributions while maximizing the commercial potential of combined innovation. The partnership attracted attention from across the medical device industry, not just for the technical achievements, but for the innovative approach to intellectual property sharing. Harvard Business School requested permission to develop a case study about our collaboration model, and several other engineering partnerships began adopting similar frameworks. 6 months after Jennifer's initial visit, we were ready to announce the Cancer Sync system, an integrated monitoring platform that combined continuous biomarker analysis with predictive cancer detection. The technology could identify malignant changes at the cellular level weeks before tumors became visible through traditional imaging, providing intervention opportunities that could save thousands of lives annually. The announcement generated international attention. Medical journals published articles about the breakthrough, venture capital firms competed to invest in the technology, and major healthcare systems began requesting pilot programs. But the most satisfying response came from cancer researchers who recognized that Cancer Sync represented a fundamental shift from reactive treatment to predictive prevention. Chen, a reporter from MedTech Weekly, asked during the press conference announcing Cancer Sync, "Your career has been marked by remarkable innovations and significant intellectual property successes. What advice would you give to young engineers who want to build similar careers?" The question gave me an opportunity to address something that had become increasingly important to me, ensuring that other brilliant minds wouldn't face the challenges I had experienced. "Document everything," I replied. "File provisional patents early and often. Understand your intellectual property rights before you need them, and never accept being told that your innovations belong to someone else just because they have a louder voice or higher position." What about collaborative development? How can engineers work together while protecting their individual contributions? Collaboration doesn't require surrendering ownership, I said, glancing at Jennifer, who nodded in agreement. The most successful partnerships are built on clear attribution and shared benefits, not on one person appropriating another's work. The press conference concluded with demonstrations of both MetaSync and Cancer Sync technologies, showing live biomarker readings and predictive analytics that amazed even the experienced medical journalists in attendance. But as the crowd dispersed and the equipment was packed away, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years earlier, I had been a devastated engineer whose life's work had been stolen in a corporate boardroom. Today, I was the co-founder of a medical technology partnership that held patents worth hundreds of millions of dollars and innovations that could revolutionize healthcare worldwide. The transformation hadn't happened accidentally. It had been built through careful documentation, strategic legal protection, and the courage to fight for recognition when others tried to take credit. That evening, I attended a dinner hosted by the American Society of Biomedical Engineers, where I was being honored with their Innovation Leadership Award. The ballroom was filled with colleagues, competitors, and collaborators from across the medical device industry, many of whom had followed my career transformation from unknown engineer to recognized innovator. During my acceptance speech, I spoke about the importance of creating environments where individual contributions are valued and protected. Innovation doesn't happen in vacuum, I told the audience. It emerges from individuals who feel secure enough to take risks, creative enough to challenge assumptions, and confident enough to defend their ideas when others try to claim them. After the dinner, I was approached by Dr. Patricia Wells, my former CEO at Phoenix Dynamics. I hadn't seen her since leaving the company, and her presence at the event was unexpected. "Sarah," she said, extending her hand with what appeared to be genuine warmth, "congratulations on everything you've achieved. Your success has been remarkable to watch." "Thank you, Dr. Wells. How are things at Phoenix Dynamics?" Her expression became more serious. "We've implemented significant changes based on what we learned from your situation. New policies for intellectual property attribution, individual contribution documentation, and protection against credit appropriation. I wanted you to know that your experience led to positive changes that are protecting other employees." The conversation was brief but meaningful. Learning that my confrontation with Ryan Mitchell had resulted in systematic improvements at Phoenix Dynamics added another layer of satisfaction to the victory. The fight hadn't just protected my own innovations. It had created safeguards for other engineers who might face similar challenges. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the broader implications of my journey. The patents I held were valuable, the technologies I'd developed were transformative, and the financial success was substantial. But perhaps the most important achievement was proving that brilliant women could defend their innovations, build successful careers on their own terms, and create templates for others to follow. My phone displayed several new messages from engineers around the world who had read about CancerSync and wanted advice about protecting their own intellectual property. Each message represented another person who might avoid the challenges I had faced, another innovator who could build their career with confidence rather than fear. The little girl who had dreamed of becoming an inventor had not only achieved that goal but had helped redefine what it meant to be a successful engineer in an industry that often overlooked individual contribution. The patents bore my name, the innovations reflected my vision, and the success had been earned through talent, preparation, and the courage to fight for what was rightfully mine. Ryan Mitchell's attempt to steal my recognition had inadvertently launched a career that exceeded anything I had originally envisioned. The mansplainer had been defeated, the technology had been protected, and the empire had been built, not through corporate politics or credit theft, but through documented innovation and strategic legal protection. As I pulled into my driveway and looked up at the clear Texas sky, I smiled at the irony. Ryan had tried to take credit for technology he hadn't created, and understanding he didn't possess. Instead, he had motivated me to build something far greater than either of us had imagined possible: a career, a platform, and a legacy that would inspire other women engineers for generations to come. The quiet engineer who had once hoped for recognition had become the innovator who commanded, and nobody, absolutely nobody, would ever be able to take that away from me again. 5 years had passed since I walked out of Phoenix Dynamics carrying nothing but my dignity and a patent that would change everything. Standing in the atrium of the Chen Institute for Medical Innovation, yes, they named a research facility after me, I watched a new generation of engineers and scientists hurrying between laboratories, each one working on projects that could transform healthcare for millions of people around the world. The institute was the culmination of everything I had built since that devastating Friday morning when Ryan Mitchell had stolen my presentation. What had started as a single patent dispute had evolved into a medical technology empire that held over 40 patents, employed 300 researchers, and generated annual revenues exceeding $200 million. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real measure of success wasn't financial, it was the lives being saved every day by technologies that bore my name and reflected my vision. GlucoSync devices were now used by over 500,000 diabetics worldwide, providing painless, continuous monitoring that had reduced emergency hospitalizations by 30%. Metasync systems were deployed in major hospitals across North America, predicting cardiac events and strokes with unprecedented accuracy. CancerSync technology had achieved early cancer detection rates that were revolutionizing oncology treatment protocols. My phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Lisa Park, the patent attorney, who had helped me navigate those crucial early battles. Sarah, just saw the announcement about the Nobel Committee considering medical device innovations for the Physiology Prize. Your name is being mentioned prominently in the speculation. Thought you should know. The possibility of Nobel recognition was surreal, but it represented something far more significant than personal achievement. It would validate the principle that individual innovators deserve recognition for their contributions, regardless of corporate politics or gender bias. More importantly, it would inspire other women engineers who might be facing their own battles against credit theft and professional appropriation. Walking through the institute's corridors, I passed laboratories where researchers were pushing the boundaries of what medical technology could achieve. The Advanced Biosensor Lab was developing microscopic monitoring devices that could be injected directly into the bloodstream. The Predictive Analytics Center was using artificial intelligence to identify disease patterns weeks before symptoms appeared, The regenerative technology group was creating devices that could accelerate healing and tissue repair at the cellular level. Each laboratory bore the name of its primary researcher, and more than 60% of those names belonged to women. This wasn't coincidental. The institute had been deliberately designed to create opportunities for brilliant female engineers whose contributions might be overlooked or appropriated in traditional corporate environments. The voice belonged to Maria Rodriguez, a 24-year-old biomedical engineer who had joined the institute 6 months earlier after completing her master's degree at Stanford. Do you have a moment to discuss the cardiovascular monitoring project? Maria reminded me of myself at her age, brilliant, determined, and slightly overwhelmed by the complexity of bringing revolutionary technology from concept to reality. She had developed a non-invasive method for detecting arterial blockages using ultrasonic resonance patterns, technology that could prevent heart attacks by identifying dangerous plaque buildup years before traditional diagnostic methods. What's the current status? I asked as we walked toward her laboratory. The clinical trials are exceeding all projections, she replied, her excitement evident. We're detecting arterial stenosis with 97% accuracy, and the false positive rate is below 2%. The cardiologists at Methodist Hospital are calling it a breakthrough. Her work was exceptional, but I could see something familiar in her expression, a mixture of pride and uncertainty that I recognized from my own early career. Maria, what's troubling you? The results sound remarkable. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke more quietly. Dr. Chen, there's a senior researcher at the institute who's been asking very detailed questions about my methodology. He's not officially involved with the project, but he keeps attending my presentations and taking extensive notes. It's probably nothing, but I stopped walking and turned to face her directly. Maria, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Tell me about this researcher. James Warren was a cardiovascular specialist who had joined the institute 8 months earlier with impressive credentials from Johns Hopkins. His background was legitimate, his research competent, but, as Maria described his behavior, I recognized patterns that were all too familiar. Has Dr. Warren ever explained your own technology back to you? I asked. Maria's eyes widened with recognition. Actually, yes. Last week he started telling me about ultrasonic resonance principles as if I hadn't developed the entire theoretical framework myself. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. During which I learned that Dr. Warren had been systematically gathering information about Maria's research while positioning himself as a mentor and strategic advisor. His questions weren't innocent curiosity, they were intelligence gathering designed to understand her innovations well enough to claim collaborative credit. Maria, here's what we're going to do, I said, leading her to my office. First, you're going to document every interaction you've had with Dr. Warren. Second, we're going to file provisional patents on every aspect of your cardiovascular monitoring technology. Third, we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Warren that makes clear the consequences of attempting to appropriate your work. The situation with Dr. Warren became a teaching moment for the entire institute. Rather than handling it quietly, I decided to address it openly. During our monthly all-hands meeting, with Dr. Warren present. The message needed to be clear: the Chen Institute would not tolerate any form of credit theft or intellectual property appropriation. Research collaboration requires mutual respect and clear attribution, I told the assembled staff. Individual contributions must be acknowledged, documented, and protected. Anyone who attempts to claim credit for work they didn't perform will face immediate termination and potential legal action. Dr. Warren's resignation was submitted the following day. His departure sent a clear message throughout the institute that brilliant researchers would be protected from the kind of exploitation that had once threatened my own career. Maria's cardiovascular monitoring technology went on to receive FDA approval in record time, and she became the youngest researcher ever to hold a primary patent at the institute. More importantly, she had learned early in her career that documentation and legal protection were essential tools for any serious innovator. The Warren incident reinforced something I had been developing over the years:
a comprehensive framework for protecting individual contributors in collaborative environments. The Chen protocols, as they had become known throughout the medical device industry, provided specific guidelines for attribution, documentation, and intellectual property protection that were being adopted by companies worldwide. Major corporations were implementing Chen protocol training for managers and researchers, teaching them to recognize and prevent credit appropriation before it occurred. Medical schools were incorporating intellectual property protection into their engineering curricula. Professional organizations were establishing awards for companies that demonstrated exceptional commitment to individual recognition and attribution. The ripple effects extended far beyond medical technology. The software industry had adapted Chen protocols for protecting individual programmers' contributions to large development projects. Academic institutions were using them to ensure that graduate students received appropriate credit for research innovation. Even consulting firms were implementing attribution frameworks based on principles I had developed through painful personal experience. My assistant Elena knocked on my office door, interrupting my reflection on the Institute's growing influence. Dr. Chen, there's someone here to see you who says it's important. Ryan Mitchell. The name hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't heard from Ryan since the day he walked out of Phoenix Dynamics 5 years earlier, and I had assumed our paths would never cross again. My first instinct was to refuse the meeting, but curiosity overcame caution. Send him in, I said, preparing myself for a conversation I had never expected to have. Ryan Mitchell looked older and considerably less confident than the man who had once stolen my presentation with such arrogance. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that his career had clearly not recovered from the patent dispute that had destroyed his reputation in the medical device industry. Sarah, he began, his voice lacking any trace of the condescension I remembered. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I have no right to ask for your time. I gestured for him to sit down, remaining standing myself to maintain the psychological advantage. What do you want, Ryan? I wanted to apologize, he said, his words coming slowly as if he had rehearsed them many times. What I did to you at Phoenix Dynamics was unconscionable. I took credit for your work. I diminished your contributions, and I tried to build my career on innovations that belonged to you. The apology was unexpected, but I wasn't ready to accept it at face value. Why now, Ryan? Why after 5 years? He looked down at his hands, clearly struggling with whatever had brought him to my office. Because I've spent 5 years watching you build an empire based on the technology I tried to steal. Because every article about your success reminds me of my own failure. Because I want to do something meaningful with whatever's left of my career, and I know I can't do that without acknowledging what I did to you. What exactly are you asking for? Nothing, he replied, looking up to meet my eye. I'm not asking for forgiveness, or a job, or any kind of opportunity. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I did, and that I'm genuinely sorry for it. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, during which Ryan described the professional consequences he had faced after leaving Phoenix Dynamics. Word of the patent dispute had spread quickly through the medical device industry, making him essentially unemployable in any role involving technology development or innovation management. He had spent the intervening years working in unrelated fields, trying to rebuild some semblance of a career from the wreckage of his reputation. Sarah, I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to understand that what I did wasn't just wrong, it was stupid. You're one of the most brilliant engineers I've ever encountered, and instead of supporting your innovations, I tried to steal them. It was the worst decision of my professional life. When Ryan finally left my office, I sat alone for a long time, processing the encounter. His apology had seemed genuine, but more importantly, it had provided closure that I hadn't realized I needed. The man who had once tried to destroy my career had been reduced to someone seeking forgiveness from the success he had attempted to steal. The irony was perfect. Ryan's attempt to claim credit for GlucoSync technology had motivated me to fight harder, think strategically, and build protections that had ultimately led to creating something far greater than either of us had originally envisioned. His betrayal had become the catalyst for my empire. That evening, I attended the annual Medical Device Innovation Gala, where I was being honored with the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Association of Biomedical Engineers. The ballroom was filled with colleagues, competitors, and collaborators who had witnessed my transformation from unknown engineer to industry leader. During my acceptance speech, I spoke about the importance of protecting innovation and supporting individual contributors. The greatest threat to technological progress isn't technical complexity or market competition, I told the audience. It's the appropriation of individual contributions by those who mistake management for innovation and mistake volume for expertise. The response was thunderous applause, but more meaningfully, I could see recognition in the faces of the younger engineers in the audience. These were people who understood exactly what I was talking about, who had their own stories of dismissed contributions and stolen credit. After the ceremony, I was approached by dozens of researchers and engineers who shared their own experiences with credit theft and intellectual property appropriation. Each conversation reinforced my understanding that the Chen Institute and the Chen protocols were addressing a systematic problem that affected brilliant minds across every technical field. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, my partner in the cancer detection venture, joined me for a late dinner after the gala. Our collaboration had evolved into one of the most successful medical technology partnerships in the industry, with joint patents worth hundreds of millions of dollars and technologies that were saving lives worldwide. Sarah, Jennifer said, as we reviewed the latest clinical data from our CancerSync deployment, do you ever think about what would have happened if Ryan Mitchell hadn't stolen your presentation that day? The question was intriguing because I had wondered the same thing many times. I probably would have stayed at Phoenix Dynamics, received modest recognition for GlucoSync, and spent my career as a senior engineer working on incremental improvements to existing technology. Instead, his betrayal motivated you to build something that's revolutionizing healthcare worldwide. The best revenge, I replied, is massive success that makes your enemies irrelevant. Our conversation shifted to the future of medical monitoring technology and the next generation of innovations emerging from the Chen Institute. Researchers were developing implantable devices that could provide continuous monitoring for decades without battery replacement. Artificial intelligence systems were being trained to predict rare diseases based on subtle biomarker patterns. Nanotechnology sensors were approaching the capability to detect individual cancer cells in real time. The possibilities were endless, and each innovation would bear the name of its creator, protected by patents and attribution protocols that ensured individual contributors received appropriate recognition and compensation. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a basement laboratory at Phoenix Dynamics to the pinnacle of medical device innovation. The patents I held were valuable, the technologies I had developed were transformative, and the institute I had built was training the next generation of protected innovators. But perhaps the most satisfying achievement was knowing that Ryan Mitchell's attempt to steal my recognition had inadvertently created a template for protecting brilliant minds from similar exploitation. The Chen protocols were being used worldwide to ensure that individual contributions were documented, attributed, and legally protected. The little girl who had dreamed of becoming an inventor had not only achieved that goal but had fundamentally changed how innovation was recognized and protected in collaborative environments. The mansplainer had been defeated, the technology had been protected, and the legacy would endure for generations. My phone displayed a final message of the evening, from Jake. Saw your speech online, big sister. You didn't just beat the guy who tried to steal your work, you made it impossible for anyone to do that to the next generation of brilliant women. That's a legacy worth building. He was right. The empire I had built wasn't just about patents and profits, it was about ensuring that every brilliant mind would have the tools and protections needed to defend their innovations and build careers based on recognized contributions, rather than stolen credit. Ryan Mitchell had tried to take what belonged to me, but instead he had motivated me to create something far greater than what he had attempted to steal. The quiet engineer who had once hoped for recognition had become the innovator who commanded it, and who had made sure that others would never face the same battles alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.